Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. The distant stars blinked in eerie silence as the tribunal's chamber pulsed with otherworldly energy. A towering room, with translucent walls that reflected the icy glow of alien constellations, served as the backdrop for an event that could change the fate of an entire species. The human soldier, Lieutenant Jared Blake, stood stiffly in the center of the chamber, shackled by metallic bonds that gleamed like the cruel eyes of the alien spectators watching him. His heart raced with uncertainty, and a knot twisted in his stomach. Blake had never imagined that a simple diplomatic mission would lead him to the unfamiliar and perilous world of the Tauri, a race of highly advanced, all-female aliens. His people, the humans, had sent him as an ambassador to negotiate peace between the Tauri and their bitter rivals, the Rin. Instead of diplomacy, the mission had descended into chaos. Blake had been accused of an unspeakable crime by the Tauri, the very race he had sought to broker peace with. The Tauri's tribunal, made up of 8 elder females who governed the entire species, now held Blake in their thrall. These women were the embodiment of both power and wisdom, their alien physiology towering over him, their pale, glowing skin contrasting against the dark and jagged architectural design of the courtroom. Their 4-eyed faces were cold and unfeeling, as if Blake were nothing more than a specimen to be studied, a curiosity to be examined. Lieutenant Jared Blake began Tribunal Chairwoman Xylaris, her voice a silky cadence that reverberated through the room. You stand before us accused of transgressing the most sacred of our customs. A breach of protocol so grave that it cannot be overlooked. Blake clenched his fists, his mind racing. The crime, as absurd as it sounded, was that he had violated the ancient Tauri ritual during an interaction with a female emissary of the Rin. The Tauri believed that to engage in the peaceful exchange of culture, bonding rituals must occur between male and female species. This was their way of ensuring the peaceful passage of important discussions. But Blake, bewildered by the sudden turn of events, had inadvertently shattered their belief system during an innocent conversation. For the Tauri, the male species, especially humans, were seen as inferior and their mating rituals integral to maintaining balance and respect within their world. Any deviation from their complex customs was considered a personal affront, one that required immediate consequences. Blake's mind flickered back to the events that had led him here. He recalled meeting emissary Zalara, a beautiful, dark-haired Tauri diplomat. She had welcomed him into her home with grace and charm, but it had been during the ceremonial dinner that everything fell apart. He had unknowingly made light of their mating customs, suggesting that humans had different and more relaxed traditions. Zalara had laughed, but the elders had overheard, and that was when everything had spiraled into chaos. At first, Blake thought it might be some sort of misunderstanding, but the truth was much darker. The Tauri elders believed that by mocking their customs, Blake had dishonored their sacred values, something which the tribunal considered unforgivable. Now he was on trial, caught in the web of a foreign culture far more intricate and unforgiving than anything he had ever faced. We, the Tauri Tribunal, have deliberated long and hard, Xylaris continued, her words like a sentence of death hanging in the air. For your crime, you shall be forced to partake in the sacred ritual of mating with the females of our species. Only through this sacred union can you redeem yourself in the eyes of the Tauri and restore honor to your name. Blake's face went pale. He had heard rumors of the Tauri customs. They were notorious for their commitment to tradition, and this ritual was among the most feared and revered within their society. The specifics were unknown to the outside world, but there were whispers of physical and psychological trials that no male could endure without being changed forever. Mating with the Tauri females wasn't just about biology. It was an intense, spiritual and cultural rite, a public display of submission, unity, and most importantly, reverence. The very idea sent a chill down Blake's spine. He was a soldier, not a ceremonial pawn. His body, hardened from years of combat, was not meant for the delicate intricacies of an alien mating ritual. He had been trained to survive gunfire, to lead in battle, to protect and defend. Yet now, his fate lay in the hands of the Tauri's unforgiving customs. I protest, Blake said, his voice cracking under the weight of his disbelief. "This is madness. I'm a soldier, not a specimen for your rituals. You can't do this." Xylaris's eyes narrowed. "We do not take kindly to protests, Lieutenant Blake. Your actions are a reflection of your disrespect for our way of life. You have no choice but to comply with the ritual. Refusal would be an act of defiance that would only serve to dishonor you further." Blake's heart thudded painfully in his chest. This wasn't a trial. It was a twisted game, a ritual he had no chance of escaping. The thought of participating in this barbaric practice made his stomach churn. Yet he had no other option. The Tauri would make sure of that. Suddenly, he felt the cold press of the Tribunal's gaze upon him, the weight of his future pressing down with the suffocating force of inevitability. He had been convicted, sentenced not just by law but by the unforgiving will of an ancient and powerful alien race. The soldiers of Earth had faced countless enemies in space, but none had prepared Blake for the humiliating challenge that awaited him in the alien arena. The air was thick with tension as Blake was escorted from the tribunal chamber, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, humiliation. Each gnawed at his resolve, a whirlwind of chaos inside him. He had never imagined that his career, his future, would hinge on something so utterly foreign. No training in the military had prepared him for this. He was escorted through long, cold halls of polished black stone. The alien architecture seemed to close in on him, the walls sleek and unyielding. The Tauri soldiers who flanked him were silent, their four eyes constantly scanning, watching him like he was a dangerous animal that could break free at any moment. Their long, flowing robes made them seem more like shadows than living beings, their presence oppressive and intimidating. Blake had hoped there would be a way out, some form of diplomatic leverage, some secret method to escape the sentence. But the Tauri were not like humans. Their customs were law, and no one had ever survived defying them. He'd heard of a few human prisoners who had attempted to flee during the ritual, only to be found dead in the alien deserts days later, their bodies broken and left as warnings for others. His escorts finally stopped before a large, ornate door. It was circular, made from an unfamiliar, shimmering material that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. One of the Tauri soldiers gestured for Blake to enter, and the door opened silently, revealing a large, dimly lit chamber. Inside, several women in flowing robes were waiting, their eyes fixed on him as though he were nothing more than a mere object of interest. A sudden shiver ran through him. He couldn't deny the intensity of their gaze. These were not mere beings. They were the embodiment of a culture that had lived for millennia, their lives deeply entwined with rituals that were unfathomable to him. "Enter, Lieutenant," a soft voice called from the center of the room. It was Zalara, the emissary he had offended. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. She stood with an air of regal authority, despite the warmth in her tone. Blake entered the chamber, every step a reminder of his helplessness. He had no choice but to comply with their rules. His mind still raced with questions. What did this ritual entail? How far would it go? He had no answers, only the haunting sense of being at their mercy. Zalara motioned for him to kneel before her, and though every ounce of his pride screamed in defiance, Blake did as commanded. His knees hit the cold floor with a resounding thud. The women around him made no move to acknowledge him. They simply observed, waiting silent as statues. Blake's pulse quickened, his military training kicking in. He wanted to analyze, to assess the situation, but there was nothing to analyze here. No escape, no strategy, only submission. "You've been chosen, Lieutenant Blake," Zalara said, her voice smooth like velvet, yet tinged with an undeniable strength. "You will serve as the vessel for a greater purpose, not just for your people but for ours. This ritual is not merely a punishment. It is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your worth and honor. We are not cruel. We only seek balance, understanding. It is your choice how you respond." Blake raised his head, meeting her gaze. The words felt hollow. He had heard her type before, the diplomats who spun webs of diplomacy to make the unbearable seem like a mere formality. But this was no negotiation. This was a trial of strength, of endurance, and of will. The harsh reality was that he had no say in the matter. His choice was already made. Zalara continued, "Your participation in this sacred rite will not be easy. It will test your body, mind, and spirit. The Tauri believe that true unity can only come when the male offers himself fully, without reservation, to the female. The deeper the connection forged in this ritual, the greater the peace it will bring to both our peoples." Blake didn't know if he could stomach her words. Peace? Unity? What kind of peace involved humiliating another species in such a manner? And yet, as he looked around at the faces of the Tauri women, so serene, so utterly unaffected, he realized that the meaning behind their customs was beyond his understanding. One of the women stepped forward. She was tall, her lavender skin glowing faintly under the chamber's low light. Her 4 eyes blinked in unison, scanning Blake with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "We will begin," the woman said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. There was no malice in her words, but there was also no pity. Just a cold, unyielding purpose. Blake felt a wave of helplessness wash over him as the women closed in. The air was thick with their presence, each step a reminder of his inability to control the situation. The Tauri didn't care about his discomfort, his confusion. They cared only for their ritual, their tradition. A strange sensation rippled through his chest as Zalara knelt beside him, her delicate fingers brushing against his cheek. "Do not resist, Lieutenant. We have chosen you for this task. You will find strength in surrender. There is power in submission." He wanted to shout, to argue, to run. But there was nowhere to run. The doors to the chamber were locked, and even if he could escape the room, he knew the Tauri would hunt him down. There was no winning against a species this powerful, this ancient. With a resigned sigh, Blake closed his eyes. There would be no glory here, no triumph, only the strange, unforgiving customs of an alien world. And in this moment, he realized there was nothing he could do but endure. As Zalara's hand lingered on his face, Blake wondered what his life would be like after this ritual. Would he ever be the same? Would he ever escape the shadow of the Tauri's customs? Or had he already become something else entirely? The answer, he feared, lay somewhere deep within the ritual that was about to begin. The room seemed to close in tighter, the air heavy with unspoken expectations. Blake's mind raced, thoughts conflicting in every direction, but none of them offered a solution. No military tactics, no combat training could have prepared him for this. Every breath felt like it was being drawn from a deeper well of exhaustion, his chest tightening under the weight of his helplessness. Zalara, still kneeling beside him, placed her fingers on his temple, her touch like a cool breeze against the feverish heat of his skin. "This is not a punishment, Blake," she said softly. "It is an exchange, one of trust and connection. You will see in time." Blake clenched his jaw. "I don't know if I'll ever see it that way." She gave him a small, almost sad smile, and then stood, her robe flowing around her like liquid silver. The other Tauri women who had been silently watching stepped forward in unison, encircling him. Their movements were graceful, precise, and somehow disconcerting in their perfect synchronization. Blake felt trapped, caught in the quiet before the storm. The woman with the lavender skin, who had spoken earlier, stepped closer to him, her 4 eyes fixed on him with a knowing intensity. She held something in her hands, something small and crystalline. A device, perhaps. She offered it to him. "This will help you understand the process. Without it, you will remain adrift, confused." Blake hesitated. He wasn't sure what this strange artifact could do to him, but in his current state, it was hard to refuse. He reached out, and the moment his fingers made contact with the crystal, a sharp pulse of energy coursed through him. His body stiffened involuntarily as the world around him seemed to flicker and shift. The chamber vanished. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say the chamber expanded. Ripples of reality folding in on themselves as if Blake were being pulled into a new dimension altogether. Colors he had never seen before stretched across his vision. Vast landscapes formed and dissolved in an endless loop. He could hear voices, whispers that carried no language he understood but reverberated in his very bones. "This is the right," Zalara's voice echoed in his mind, her presence both distant and intimate. "The sacred connection is forged not just by the body but by the soul. Only when your spirit has been fully opened can you take part in the ritual." Blake gasped, feeling his heart race as he fought the overwhelming sensations that flooded his consciousness. His body was no longer his own. He could feel his thoughts breaking apart and reforming, as though the crystal had unlocked a door to something deeper, something alien to him. He staggered, disoriented. The Tauri women surrounded him, their faces now clear as the distorted world around him began to settle. Their expressions were serene, patient, and expectant. Zalara's voice continued within him, but now it wasn't just her words. It was a presence, a feeling, like a part of his own mind speaking to him. "Let go. Trust in the ritual. Only then will you see the truth of your purpose here." Blake felt a surge of resistance rise within him. "I'm not some pawn in a game," he shouted internally, though the words seemed weak in the face of the overwhelming force pressing on him. "I'm a soldier. I fight to survive." The world around him rippled again, and for a brief moment, he felt his grip on reality slip. His breathing grew shallow as he realized that resistance wasn't just futile. It would break him. He had no choice but to let go, to surrender to the alien power that surrounded him. The intensity of the experience was too great, too overwhelming. With a grunt of frustration, Blake closed his eyes. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't defeat. It was survival. He had to survive this. And then it happened. A sudden clarity washed over him. The flood of chaotic thoughts quieted, and a stillness settled deep in his chest. He wasn't sure when it happened, but somehow he became aware of something deep inside, something ancient, primal. The connection between his mind and the Tauri women was real. He could feel their presence in a way that defied logic, like they were linked to him in ways his human mind couldn't fully comprehend. Zalara, seeing the shift in his posture, nodded approvingly. "Good. You are beginning to understand." The lavender-skinned Tauri woman moved closer, her hands reaching toward his face, and Blake flinched instinctively. But instead of touching him, she merely hovered her hands near his skin. Her 4 eyes studied him closely, as if searching for something. "The mind is the first to be tested. The body will follow." A strange warmth emanated from her palms, and Blake could feel it seep into his skin, into his bones, filling the very core of his being with an unfamiliar energy. His muscles, once tight with fear, began to loosen. The tension in his chest slowly melted away, replaced by something new, something beyond discomfort, beyond dread. It was warmth, yes, but also power. It was as if the women around him weren't just manipulating his body, they were opening something within him. And the strange part was he didn't feel entirely repulsed by it. In fact, it felt strangely natural, as though this ancient connection was something buried deep within his human nature, just waiting to be unlocked. Blake's mind reeled. How could something so alien feel so, right? How could he possibly accept this? And yet, a deeper part of him realized that the more he resisted, the more disconnected he would become. The Tauri had something that he could never have, something unique to their species, a deep bond of shared understanding. And to partake in this ritual, he would need to grasp that understanding, even if it meant surrendering his preconceived notions of power, control, and duty. Zalara stepped forward, her voice no longer in his mind but in the air around him, grounding him back to the physical world. "Now the body, Blake. You must offer it freely to complete the bond. It is the final test." He didn't know how to respond to that. His instincts screamed at him to refuse, to resist, to keep fighting. But something in the way the Tauri held themselves, their calm, their control, their profound understanding, began to wear down his walls. For the first time, Blake wondered if this ritual wasn't just an alien construct, but something far more universal. Something that transcended species and found its roots in the very nature of life itself. He exhaled slowly, willing himself to remain calm, to focus on the task ahead. The ritual had only just begun, and though the trial was far from over, Blake now understood the gravity of the path before him. He wasn't just a soldier caught in a foreign trap. He was part of something much larger, something ancient, and he had no idea how it would change him, or what it would make him become. Blake's body moved on its own, guided by some strange force that he couldn't fully comprehend. The Tauri women had set the ritual in motion, and now there was no turning back. His mind, once clear and logical, had been swept into the currents of their will, and each breath felt like a surrender, a step deeper into a world that he had never imagined. The lavender-skinned Tauri woman who had approached him earlier gently placed her hands on his shoulders. Her touch was both warm and unyielding, and as soon as her skin made contact, Blake felt an electric pulse travel down his spine. A wave of dizziness swept over him, and his vision blurred as if the very fabric of reality were stretching and bending around him. His heartbeat quickened, and he struggled to regain control over his senses. Zalara's calm voice echoed in his mind once more. "Do not fear. The trial of the body has begun. Your spirit must yield to this process to complete the bond. You are here to learn, Lieutenant Blake, to become something greater than yourself." His chest tightened. Yield. The word felt alien, as though it had no place in the world he had come from. A soldier never yielded, never surrendered. But here, amidst these towering beings, amidst the Tauri's strange and overwhelming rituals, he was being forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. The other Tauri women moved closer, their steps silent, as if the air itself bent to their will. They stood in a semicircle around Blake, their eyes all focused on him. Their expressions were unreadable, their gazes both expectant and dispassionate. They had been here before. This was routine for them, but for Blake, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The lavender-skinned woman's eyes locked with his as she slowly raised her hand, and Blake felt something tugging at him. Something visceral, something deeply buried in his psyche. A connection was forming, not just between his body and theirs, but between his mind and their collective presence. It was a strange sensation, like a thread weaving through the air, binding him to these women in ways he couldn't explain. He shook his head, trying to push the sensation away, but it only deepened. His heart raced, his skin tingling as he felt their touch becoming more intimate, more invasive. Zalara's voice filled his mind again, gentle but firm. "You are not a prisoner here, Blake," she said. "The Tauri do not take without offering. This ritual is a union, a meeting of minds and bodies. If you resist, you will only cause yourself harm. If you surrender, you will see. You will understand." Blake closed his eyes, trying to block out the overwhelming presence of the Tauri around him. Surrender. The word echoed in his mind like a warning bell, a reminder of everything he had been taught to resist. But something inside him was beginning to unravel. The walls he had so carefully built around himself, his sense of self-control and strength, were beginning to dissolve. And in their place, a raw, primal connection took shape, a connection that had nothing to do with logic or military strategy. One of the Tauri women stepped forward. She was tall, with deep green skin and eyes that glowed a soft, ethereal yellow. She raised her hands and, without touching him, seemed to pull something from Blake. It wasn't physical. It was his energy, his essence, his will to fight. He felt it being siphoned away, drawn into her like a stream of water flowing toward an unseen reservoir. It wasn't painful, but it was disorienting. The longer it went on, the more he felt like he was losing himself, like he was slipping into the ether, untethered from everything that had defined him. And yet, despite the fear that surged within him, there was something undeniably powerful about the experience. The Tauri were showing him a different way to exist, a way that bypassed the constraints of human understanding. It was a way of unity, of deep connection, of giving without taking. For a brief moment, Blake saw flashes of alien history, visions of the Tauri's past, their struggles, their triumphs, and their unyielding bond to one another. It was as if their collective consciousness was being shared with him, a flood of knowledge and experience that surpassed anything he had ever known. Zalara's voice once more reached him. "This is the beginning of your understanding. You will feel what we feel, Blake. You will see the world through our eyes. This bond is not just physical. It is spiritual. It is timeless. He shook his head, struggling to comprehend the vastness of what was happening. This wasn't just a ritual, it was a transformation. And as much as he wanted to fight it, to pull away and break free, he knew deep down that there was no escape. The Tauri had woven themselves into the very fabric of his being, and the ritual was pulling him deeper into their world. Another Tauri woman, this one with pale blue skin, approached him. Her gaze was soft, her movements deliberate. She raised her hands to his chest, and as she did, Blake felt a pulse of energy ripple through him. It was as if she were pressing against his very soul, forcing him to face something he had never wanted to confront. The depths of his own vulnerability, the hardness that had defined him as a soldier. His rigid control, his unyielding pride began to dissolve. In its place was something raw, something vulnerable. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. This wasn't about physical intimacy. This was about breaking down the barriers between them, about exposing his inner self to the Tauri in a way that he had never allowed anyone to see. It was about the complete surrender of everything he had once thought to be his identity. Zalara spoke again, this time her voice soft, almost tender. The right is a gift, Blake. You will never understand its true meaning until you accept it. Only then will you know what it means to be part of something greater. Blake's body trembled, his resolve cracking. He could feel his humanity slipping away, replaced by the ancient, alien presence of the Tauri. Their power was not just physical. It was a force that reached deep into his mind, pulling him toward them, compelling him to give up his resistance. And for the first time, Blake didn't know whether he was afraid or something else entirely. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand. But there was no going back. The descent was inevitable. The ritual had him in its grip, and all he could do now was surrender to its unfolding, to whatever end it would bring. Blake's thoughts, once filled with sharp edges and military precision, were now softened, like fragmented pieces of glass in a foggy, shifting landscape. He was no longer entirely himself, not in the way he had once understood. The Tauri women's presence surrounded him, a suffocating but strangely comforting aura, and his resistance was crumbling under its weight. They were not just with him. They were within him, touching parts of his mind he had never allowed anyone to see, not even himself. The walls around his psyche, the boundaries he had fought so hard to protect, had all but evaporated. He could feel his breath coming in slow, deliberate gasps. The heat from the lavender-skinned Tauri woman's hands still lingered on his skin, as though she had marked him, and the sensation spread like wildfire, reaching into the deepest recesses of his being. It was more than physical. It was mental, spiritual, an overwhelming pressure that made him feel as if he were caught in the very heart of a storm. Zalara's voice broke through the tumult of his thoughts once more, a soft whisper in the back of his mind. Let go, Blake. You are no longer a soldier in this moment. You are becoming something else. Something eternal. The words sent a shiver through him, and though his body was betraying him, his mind still fought to hold on to what he knew. Something eternal. He could feel the Tauri's collective consciousness, an ancient intelligence that stretched across generations, watching him, guiding him, urging him to surrender completely. He had always been taught to stand firm, to remain resolute, but here, amidst the alien energy, he found himself faltering. The green-skinned Tauri woman, who had been quietly observing him until now, approached. Her ethereal yellow eyes were warm but unreadable, and as she drew near, Blake could sense a change in the air. It was a subtle shift, a thickening of the atmosphere, as though the very space between them had expanded to include something larger than the physical world. She reached out, her hands moving gracefully toward his chest, and this time, Blake didn't flinch. Instead, he found himself leaning into her touch, almost as if it were magnetic. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of his uniform, then against his skin. As soon as her hands made contact, Blake gasped, the sensation flooding him. It was as though he could feel every single atom of his body coming alive, thrumming with energy that was foreign to him, but somehow familiar in a way that made his heart race. You will understand, Blake. The green-skinned woman's voice resonated within him. It was not just spoken, but felt, experienced. You will understand what it means to connect beyond the body, beyond the mind. You will understand the unity that binds all life. His vision blurred again, the room around him flickering as if reality itself was bending under the weight of the Tauri's presence. He could see their faces now, the sharpness of their features softened by an energy he couldn't resist. Their eyes weren't just looking at him, they were seeing into him. And in their gazes, Blake felt exposed, raw, like a wild animal caught in a trap. But there was no fear. In fact, the more he allowed himself to surrender to their gaze, the more he felt his tension melt away, his body losing its fight for control. He was aware of everything, yet detached, as though he were standing outside of himself, watching the process unfold. It was an out-of-body experience, a merging of himself with something far greater than anything he had ever imagined. Zalara stepped forward now, her eyes full of quiet intensity. The final stage is upon us, Lieutenant. The union is not complete until you offer yourself fully. Your body, your mind, your spirit. Every part of you must be given without reservation. Only then will the bond be solidified. Blake felt a knot of unease twist in his stomach, but it was different now. It was no longer the sharp, visceral fear of being trapped, of being forced into submission. It was an awareness of what was at stake. The Tauri weren't asking for something they could take. They were inviting him to participate in something greater, to connect with them in ways that defied all logic. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't pull away. The realization slowly dawned on him that the Tauri had no need to break him. They were offering him something he had never known, something beyond the bounds of human experience. The air in the room grew heavier as Zalara moved closer, her voice soft but carrying the weight of authority. You will not remain the same after this, Blake. You will change just as we have, but you will not be lost. You will gain something. Understanding, connection, a shared existence that transcends all boundaries. Blake closed his eyes, struggling to breathe through the tightness in his chest. He had once believed in the strength of his independence, in the power of the individual. But the Tauri had shown him another way, the way of unity, of collective strength, of balance. In that moment, the weight of the ritual hit him all at once. He was not just a participant. He was becoming a part of the Tauri themselves, a thread woven into their ancient tapestry. His sense of self, his identity as a soldier, was fading, replaced by something broader, more ancient, more infinite. This union, this ritual, was not just about him. It was about the convergence of two worlds, two species, into one harmonious existence. He opened his eyes again, meeting Zalara's gaze. This time, there was no defiance, no resistance in him. There was only acceptance. His voice, hoarse and uncertain, broke through the silence. I'm ready, Zalara smiled, and for the first time it wasn't a smile of superiority or judgment. It was a smile of acknowledgement, of understanding. She reached out and gently touched his forehead, a soft connection that seemed to send a pulse through his entire body. In that instant, Blake felt his own thoughts merge with hers, with the others around him. The boundaries between them blurred, and for the first time he was not alone. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He wasn't just a human, confined to his own limited experience of the world. In this moment, Blake understood what it meant to be part of something much larger, something eternal. The ritual had come full circle, and as the Tauri women closed in around him, their hands brushing his skin, their presence enveloping him, Blake let go of everything he had once known. He allowed himself to be swept into their collective consciousness, to become one with them, knowing that this was the beginning of something that could never be undone. Blake felt himself slipping deeper into the fold of the Tauri, no longer aware of the physical world, no longer tied to the identity he had carried for so long. His mind swirled with alien knowledge, unfamiliar sensations, and a profound sense of unity that he could barely comprehend. He had become something more than a human soldier, a link in a chain that stretched across galaxies, a part of a living, breathing network of consciousness. The faces of the Tauri women surrounded him, their expressions serene and knowing, their eyes glowing with an ancient wisdom. But now their faces seemed different, not alien, not separate from him. They were part of him, and he was part of them. It wasn't just their touch, their presence, that connected them. It was something deeper, an unspoken bond that was woven between their minds, something that was both terrifying and comforting in its depth. The lavender-skinned Tauri woman, who had guided him through the early stages of the ritual, stepped closer. Her presence was like a beacon, radiating warmth and understanding, drawing him in with an irresistible pull. "You are seeing the truth now, Blake," she said, her voice a harmonious melody in his mind. No longer just words, but a direct experience of her being. The bond is not just between bodies. It is between hearts and minds. It is an exchange of essence, one that transcends the limits of time and space. You have felt the power of this unity, the strength of this connection. Do you now understand? Blake struggled to find words. His breath was ragged, his thoughts a jumble of emotions, sensations, and understanding that seemed to defy the human mind. But one thing was clear, something profound had occurred. He wasn't just a passive participant in a ritual anymore. He had crossed into something far greater. He had become part of the Tauri, and in doing so had transcended the very boundaries that had defined his existence. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the realization pressing down on him. I think I understand." Zalara, standing nearby, smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "You are not alone anymore, Blake. You are one with us. The knowledge we carry, the history of our people, the very essence of our existence, it is now yours as well. You are not just a guest here. You are family, family." The word reverberated in Blake's mind, and for a fleeting moment, he thought of Earth, of the people he had left behind, of the life he had once known. The stark contrast between the isolation of his former life and the profound sense of belonging he now felt made him ache. He had never truly understood what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, something unbreakable and eternal. But now, in this moment, he did. His chest swelled with emotions he hadn't anticipated: regret, longing, and even a strange sense of peace. The Tauri had shown him something that his human mind couldn't have conceived. They had offered him not just power, but a deep connection to the universe itself, to the very fabric of life that tied everything together. A soft hum filled the air, and Blake realized that the Tauri were not just communicating with him. They were communicating with each other, their voices merging into a single, harmonious melody. It was as if their collective consciousness was alive, vibrating with an energy that resonated through his entire being. The green-skinned Tauri woman stepped forward now, her yellow eyes glowing with an inner light. "There is more you must understand, Blake. The bond you have entered is not without purpose. We do not seek to dominate or control. We seek to share, to grow together. Your people, the humans, are at a crossroads. You are on the brink of something greater, but you cannot do it alone. You will need to unite with others, just as we have united with you." Blake's mind spun. "Unite with others? What do you mean?" Zalara's voice answered, calm and measured. "We have watched your species for many years, Blake. We know of your struggles, your conflicts, your desire to survive. But survival is not enough. You must evolve. You must break free from the chains of division, from the hatred and the war that plague your kind. Only then will you reach the potential that lies dormant within you." Blake felt a cold chill run through him. The idea that his species, humankind, had the potential for something greater was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had seen the worst of humanity in his years as a soldier, the brutality, the violence, the endless conflicts that seemed to define his people. Could they truly change? Could they evolve beyond their destructive tendencies? He felt the weight of the Tauri's collective gaze upon him, and despite the overwhelming pressure, there was no judgment in it, only understanding and a quiet, patient expectation. "We are offering you the opportunity, Blake," the green-skinned woman continued. "But it is not a simple gift. It is a path that you must walk, and you will not walk it alone. We are with you, and so are others. But you must be willing to lead, to show your people the way. Lead." The word struck Blake like a lightning bolt. He had never thought of himself as a leader. He was a soldier, a tool for the will of others. But now, standing here among the Tauri, he felt something stir inside him. A sense of purpose that was deeper than anything he had ever known. It wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about victory. It was about something greater, something worth fighting for. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't here just for the Tauri. He wasn't here just to survive. He was here to become a bridge between two worlds, to bring his people to a higher state of being, to help them evolve, to help them unite. Blake took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the weight of this new understanding. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the task ahead. Zalara smiled, and for the first time, Blake saw not just the ancient wisdom of her species, but the hope that resided within it. "You must return to your people, Blake. You must show them the way even when they resist. You will be the one to lead them toward the unity we have achieved, toward the bond that transcends war and division. You will be the first of your kind to truly understand what it means to be one with the universe." Blake felt the gravity of her words settle into him. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a guide, a leader, a bridge between the Tauri and humanity. And though the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, with resistance and fear, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone. The Tauri were with him, and together, they would face whatever came next. And in that moment, Blake realized that he wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for the survival of his entire species, not as they were, but as they could be. Blake stood at the threshold of the Tauri enclave, the swirling energies of their collective consciousness still buzzing in his mind, but now tinged with the deep clarity of purpose that had solidified within him. The ritual had transformed him. He could feel the weight of his connection to the Tauri, the eternal bond that now tied him not only to them but to the very essence of the universe. The knowledge he had gained, the understanding of their ways, was a weighty mantle he had not asked for, but one he now wore with an acceptance he hadn't known he was capable of. Behind him, the Tauri women stood in silence, their presence a quiet support that reverberated through the air. Their connection to him had been completed, but they had not abandoned him. They were still with him, guiding him in ways that went beyond mere physical presence. He could feel their minds intertwined with his, their collective wisdom flowing through him like an unspoken current, pulling him toward the inevitable task that awaited him. He wasn't just a participant in their rituals anymore. He was a vessel for their legacy, a messenger for the future of humanity. Zalara approached him slowly, her gaze steady and piercing. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. Her touch wasn't just physical. It was an extension of the bond they had forged. It was an affirmation of the responsibility now laid at his feet. "Blake," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of all the years of the Tauri's existence. "You have learned what it means to truly connect. You are ready to take your place in the universe, not as a soldier, but as a leader. The path ahead will not be easy. You will face resistance, doubt, and fear from your own kind. But you must stand firm. You must show them the way forward." Blake nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. He had already faced resistance in his life, but this was different. This wasn't about tactical maneuvers or battlefield strategies. This was about changing the very fabric of human existence, something no soldier had ever been trained for. But it was something he now understood deeply. Humanity could no longer afford to live in the fractured, divisive state it had for so long. The Tauri had shown him that, and now it was his responsibility to show humanity. Zalara gave him a final, meaningful look, and then, without another word, she turned and retreated into the shadows of the enclave, leaving Blake standing alone at the edge of their domain. For a long moment, Blake simply stood there, breathing in the cool air, letting the magnitude of the situation wash over him. He wasn't sure how he could go back, how he could take what he had learned and bring it to his people. The human race was so deeply entrenched in its own fears, its wars, its distrust of the unknown. He would be seen as a traitor, a madman, a fool. if he were even allowed to speak at all. But the Tauri had been right. He could no longer think of himself as a soldier. He was a part of something greater now. He had seen what lay beyond the veil of war and division. And though he had been chosen by them, Blake knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who were ready to see the truth, to accept that there was a path forward that transcended humanity's current limitations. The shuttle waiting for him was a small, functional vessel, designed to take him back to Earth. The Tauri had provided it as a way for him to return to his people, though they had warned him that the journey would not be easy. The world he was returning to would not be the same world that had sent him to their planet. Blake knew that much. He could feel the change in his own soul. He climbed into the shuttle, his thoughts swirling like a storm inside his mind. The journey back to Earth was long, but it gave him time to reflect, time to prepare for the inevitable storm that awaited him. The stars outside the shuttle's windows flickered as he passed through the dark expanse of space, a vast void that now seemed so much smaller, so much more insignificant in the grand scheme of things. When he finally reached Earth's atmosphere, the familiar blue and green planet filling the viewports, Blake's heart tightened. He was home, but the home he was returning to was not the one he had left. His old life, the military, the chain of command, the rigid structure that had once defined him, seemed so distant, like a fading memory from another life. The shuttle touched down, and Blake stepped out onto the landing pad, the cool wind brushing against his face. The human world hadn't changed, but he had. The knowledge that had been imparted to him was still vivid, the collective wisdom of the Tauri resonating deep within him. The weight of what he had to do hung heavily on his shoulders. Blake walked forward, a deep sense of purpose anchoring his every step. His uniform felt foreign now, a relic of a past life that no longer defined him. He had shed that part of himself, and though the memories were still there, he felt as if they were fading, as though he had outgrown them. The military would see him as a hero or as a failure depending on the side of the conflict. But in the end, it wouldn't matter. He had a greater task at hand. The first few days back on Earth were a blur. He was debriefed by his superiors, questioned about his disappearance, and observed with a mixture of suspicion and awe. But Blake said little. There was no need to explain what he had learned. He knew the truth now, and if humanity was going to evolve, it would have to come to that truth on its own. He started by reaching out to those who had shown the faintest glimmers of hope for a different future. Scientists, diplomats, activists, and leaders who weren't content with the status quo. They didn't all understand what Blake had become, but some of them listened, and slowly the seeds were planted. Blake knew the journey ahead would be filled with hardships. Humanity was not ready for the change he was proposing, but in his heart he believed it was possible. He had seen the Tauri, the way they lived, the unity they shared, and he knew that humanity could find that path too, if they were willing to face the truth, to come together in a way they never had before. The Tauri had given him the gift of connection. They had shown him the way, and now it was his turn to lead. He would face resistance, no doubt. But the truth, as he had come to understand it, could not be denied forever. And no matter what came, Blake knew one thing for certain. He was no longer just a soldier. He was the first step in humanity's evolution. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stellar HFY content. Ring that bell to stay updated, and we'll see you next time.